The autumn wind carried whispers through the tobacco fields of Ashford Manor, North Carolina, in the year 1844. The leaves had begun their descent, painting the ground in shades of amber and rust, but there was something darker beneath the beauty of that season, something that would stain the red clay soil with secrets too terrible to speak aloud. The wind itself seemed to carry warnings, rustling through the dried stalks with sounds that resembled weeping, as if the very earth knew what horrors were being committed within the pristine white walls of the Manor's medical clinic. Sarah clutched her swollen belly as she walked through the Manor's kitchen garden, picking herbs for the evening meal. At 23 years old, she was expecting her third child, and the weight of it pressed against her spine as she bent to pluck thyme and rosemary. Her fingers moved mechanically through the plants, but her mind was elsewhere, trapped in the endless loop of fear that had become her constant companion. The other women worked silently around her, their faces drawn and tired, eyes that never quite met hers anymore. Something had changed at Ashford Manor in recent months, something none of them could name, but all of them felt in their bones. The silence among them was new and wrong. Before, they had whispered while they worked, sharing small jokes, humming songs from their childhood, finding moments of humanity in the brutal grind of enslaved labor. Now, an oppressive quiet hung over them like a shroud. Each woman seemed lost in her own private terror, unable or unwilling to give voice to what they all sensed but couldn't quite articulate. It was as if speaking their fears aloud would make them real, would give substance to the nightmare that was slowly consuming them all. Sarah paused in her herb gathering, straightening her back with difficulty, and looked toward the medical clinic. From the outside, it appeared benign, even admirable. A modest brick building with clean white trim, large windows that let in abundant light, a small garden of medicinal plants beside the entrance. Dr. Marcus Whitmore had designed it himself, proclaiming it a model of modern medical facility, a place where he could practice his craft with scientific precision. He had even installed gas lights inside, making it one of the few buildings on the plantation illuminated after dark. The soft glow of those lights in the evening should have been comforting, a sign of progress and civilization. Instead, it filled Sarah with dread. The manor itself stood like a white monument to prosperity, its columns gleaming in the afternoon sun, its windows reflecting the sky like dead eyes watching everything below. The architecture was Greek revival, fashionable among the wealthy plantation owners of the South, with its symmetrical facade and grand portico. But there was something about those windows that disturbed Sarah. They were too reflective, too opaque, hiding what went on inside rather than revealing it. Sometimes, late at night, she would see candlelight moving behind them and wonder what Dr. Whitmore was doing in there, alone with his medical texts and his instruments. Dr. Marcus Whitmore had purchased the estate 2 years ago, bringing with him a reputation as a physician of considerable skill and modern thinking. He had studied in Philadelphia and Europe, he claimed, learning the latest techniques in surgery and obstetrics. He spoke of scientific advancement, of progress, of the future of medicine with an evangelical fervor that the previous owner, old Mr. Ashford, had never possessed. The enslaved people of Ashford Manor had initially felt a small measure of relief when he arrived. The previous owner had been cruel in obvious ways, with whips and chains and deliberate starvation. His violence was straightforward, almost honest in its brutality. Dr. Whitmore seemed different. He smiled. He spoke softly. He promised better treatment, better food, better conditions. During his first week, he had gathered all the enslaved people in the front yard and delivered a speech about his intentions. Sarah remembered it with painful clarity. "I am a man of science," he had said, standing on the manor steps with the autumn sun behind him, making his face hard to see. "I believe in progress, in the application of reason and scientific method to all aspects of life. Under my management, you will be treated according to the principles of modern agricultural science. I will ensure your health, Your nutrition, your living conditions are optimized. In return, I expect obedience and productivity. We will build something remarkable here at Ashford Manor, a model plantation that demonstrates how scientific management can benefit everyone. The speech had sounded hopeful at the time, but Sarah had learned that cruelty wearing a smile was the most dangerous kind of all. Old Mr. Ashford had beaten bodies. Dr. Whitmore violated souls. She remembered the day Dr. Whitmore had called her into the small building he had converted into his medical clinic. It stood apart from the main manor, a modest structure of brick and wood that smelled perpetually of carbolic acid and something else, something metallic and wrong. The smell clung to your clothes after you left, marked you as having been inside. Women who had been to the clinic walked differently afterward, carrying themselves with a new kind of wariness, a new kind of broken caution. He had examined her when she was pregnant with her second child, Thomas, now 2 years old and running through the quarters with the other children, his laughter a brief spark of joy in their difficult world. Sarah could still feel the cold of the examination table against her back, the way the metal instruments gleamed in the gaslight, arranged on a white cloth with surgical precision. Dr. Whitmore had worn his white coat, spotlessly clean, and had spoken to her in that soft, reasonable voice that made everything sound benign. "Mrs. Sarah," the doctor had said, using the honorific in a way that felt mocking rather than respectful. His use of Mrs. was a cruel joke. Enslaved people couldn't legally marry. Their unions had no standing in law, but he used the title anyway, as if acknowledging her humanity while simultaneously violating it. "I'm going to help you have a safe delivery. Modern medicine, you understand. You won't feel a thing. I'll administer laudanum for the pain, and I'll use the most advanced techniques. Your baby will be healthy, and you'll recover quickly." The laudanum had made everything hazy, dreamlike. Sarah remembered the pain of childbirth, a pain that cut through the drug's fog, but there had been something else too, a different kind of pain, sharp and invasive, in a place that shouldn't have hurt. She had tried to speak, to ask what he was doing, but her tongue felt thick and useless. Dr. Whitmore's face had floated above her, blurred and indistinct, his hands doing something she couldn't see, couldn't understand. She had heard the click of instruments, felt a tugging sensation deep inside her body, wrong and violating. When she had recovered and tried to speak of it to the other women, they had fallen silent, turning away with fear in their eyes. It was Aunt Ruth, the oldest among them at 60 years, who had finally whispered the truth in the darkness of their quarters. They had been lying on their thin mattresses, the only time they could speak without being overheard, the darkness offering a small measure of safety. "He's doing something to us, child," Aunt Ruth had whispered, her voice barely audible. "During the births, taking something. I've seen too many women leave that clinic unable to bear more children, and those who ask questions." Aunt Ruth had touched her own throat, where a faint scar ran like a thread of white against her dark skin. "Those who speak up find themselves sold away before dawn." Mary questioned him once, asked why she couldn't get pregnant again. 3 days later, she was gone, sold to a rice plantation in South Carolina. They work you to death in the rice fields. She might as well have been sentenced to execution. Sarah had felt ice in her veins at these words. But why? Why would he do this? Aunt Ruth had shaken her head in the darkness. "Control, child, always about control. But it's more than that. He's experimenting on us. I hear him sometimes talking to visitors, other doctors. They speak of us like we're animals, like our bodies are just tools for their science. He keeps records, writes in his journals. I've seen the books when I clean the clinic, pages and pages about procedures, about outcomes, about failures and successes. We're not people to him. We're experiments." The memory of that conversation haunted Sarah as she stood in the kitchen garden, her pregnant belly heavy, her hands full of herbs. Aunt Ruth's words had opened her eyes to what was happening, but knowledge brought no comfort, only terror. Now, as Sarah picked herbs in the autumn light, she felt her baby kick inside her and wondered if this would be her last. The thought filled her with a terror so profound it made her hands shake. She glanced toward the clinic, its door closed, smoke rising from its chimney, even though the day was warm. Dr. Whitmore was inside, as he was most afternoons, doing his work, his terrible secret work. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner in the main house kitchen, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Dr. Whitmore was entertaining guests, other physicians from surrounding counties, and their voices carried through the speaking tube that connected the dining room to the kitchen below. The speaking tube was meant for giving orders to the kitchen staff, but it worked both ways, carrying sounds down as well as up. Sarah moved closer to it, her hands continuing their work of preparing the meal, even as every fiber of her being focused on the conversation above. "Gentlemen, I must say, this port is excellent," one of the guests was saying. "From your private stock, Marcus." "Indeed, Charles. I had it shipped directly from Portugal. Cost a small fortune, but quality has its price." Dr. Whitmore's voice was warm, genial, the voice of a man at ease among peers. "But let's discuss more interesting matters than wine. I wanted to share with you the results of my recent work here at Ashford Manor. I believe I've made significant breakthroughs in population management." There was the sound of chairs scraping, men settling in for what they clearly expected to be an interesting lecture. Sarah's hands trembled as she sliced vegetables, but she forced herself to continue working, to appear normal, even though her heart was hammering in her chest. "Population management?" another voice asked, curious. "You mean the slave population?" "Precisely, William. You see, gentlemen, slavery as currently practiced is inefficient. We breed our workers without scientific consideration, ending up with individuals of varying quality. Some are strong, healthy, intelligent, others are weak, prone to disease, troublesome. Traditional methods of management involve selling off the undesirables, but this is economically wasteful. What if, instead, we could control reproduction at its source? What if we could ensure that only the best specimens reproduce, while preventing the inferior ones from multiplying? Sarah felt bile rising in her throat. He was talking about them as if they were livestock, less than livestock. At least a farmer might feel some affection for his animals. Dr. Whitmore's voice carried only cold, analytical interest. "That's eugenics," in the first voice, Charles said. "Francis Galton has been writing about such things. But Marcus, how would you implement such a system?" "Through medical intervention, of course." Dr. Whitmore's voice took on a lecturing quality, a professor explaining to eager students. "The procedure is quite simple, gentlemen. A small incision during delivery, when the patient is already in distress and under the influence of laudanum. They never notice. I locate the fallopian tubes and either tie them off or remove a section entirely. The procedure takes mere minutes, and the incision heals alongside the natural trauma of childbirth. The patient recovers normally, resumes her work, but will never conceive again." The casual way he described it, as if he were discussing a minor agricultural technique, made Sarah's skin crawl. She thought of the pain she had felt, that strange, wrong pain during Thomas's birth. She thought of all the women who had given birth in Dr. Whitmore's clinic and had not conceived since. Elizabeth, who cried in the night. Rose, who had begun to pray obsessively, thinking herself cursed. Mary, sold away for asking questions. But Marcus, another voice interjected, sounding uncertain. "Surely this raises ethical questions. These women don't consent to such procedures. They don't even know they're being performed." Dr. Whitmore laughed, a sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. It was not the laugh of a man amused, but of someone who found the very question absurd. "Consent, Charles. They are property. You wouldn't ask your horse for consent before gelding it, would you? You wouldn't consult with your cow before deciding which bull to breed her with. This is simply modern animal husbandry applied with scientific rigor. The only difference is that our subjects are more complex, capable of speech and rudimentary reasoning, which makes the management both more challenging and more fascinating. I suppose, Charles said slowly, still sounding doubtful. But they are human, Marcus, even if the law classifies them as property. Don't we have some moral obligation? Human, yes, in the biological sense, Dr. Whitmore conceded, and Sarah could hear the sound of him pouring more wine, the clink of crystal. But humanity exists on a spectrum, Charles. The Negro is a lesser form of human, closer to the animal than to civilized man. This is proven science. The measurements of their skulls, the size of their brains, their inability to create advanced civilizations without white guidance. All evidence points to them being a separate, inferior race. Therefore, managing them as we would manage livestock is not only permissible, but necessary for the proper functioning of our society and economy. Mower, how many have you performed this procedure on? William asked, and his voice carried professional interest now, the ethical qualms apparently set aside. 18 successful operations in the past 2 years, Dr. Whitmore said, and Sarah could hear the pride in his voice. Not one has conceived since. The procedure has a 100% success rate. I've been documenting everything meticulously. Detailed case notes, illustrations of the technique, follow-up observations. I'm planning to publish a paper on it, though of course I'll need to be careful about how I present the information. The abolitionists are becoming increasingly vocal, and we don't want to give them ammunition. 18, William repeated, sounding impressed. That's remarkable, Marcus. And you say the patients show no adverse effects? None whatsoever. They recover normally from childbirth, return to work within the usual time frame. Several have expressed concern about not conceiving again, but I've told them it's simply God's will, that sometimes women become barren after difficult births. They accept this explanation readily enough. The ignorant are easy to deceive when you speak with authority. Sarah's hands had stopped moving. She stood frozen at the speaking tube, hearing them discuss the systematic mutilation of women as if it were no more significant than a discussion of crop rotation. 18 women. She knew them all. She had shared quarters with some of them, had worked beside others in the fields. She thought of young Mary, only 21, who had stopped laughing after her baby was born. Elizabeth, who had been so desperate for another child that she had tried every folk remedy anyone could suggest. Rose, who had turned to frantic prayer, believing herself cursed by God for some imagined sin. And all along it had been Dr. Marcus Whitmore, playing God with a scalpel and his scientific arrogance. I must say, this could revolutionize plantation management, another guest was saying. If we could control which workers reproduce, we could essentially breed a superior workforce over time, keep the strong and intelligent, eliminate the weak and troublesome from the bloodline. Exactly. Dr. Whitmore's voice was enthusiastic now, energized by finding appreciative audience. That's precisely my vision. Imagine plantation where every worker is healthy, strong, docile, where troublemakers don't pass on their rebellious tendencies to offspring, where the weak and sickly simply fade out of the population. We could create a perfect workforce, a model for the entire South. And it all begins with controlling female reproduction. Sarah dropped the ladle she was holding, the clatter of metal against stone floor echoing through the kitchen. The other women working around her froze, staring at her. She saw her own horror reflected in their faces. Some had clearly heard the conversation through the speaking tube. Others read the terror in Sarah's expression and understood without words that something terrible had been revealed. Above them, the conversation continued, oblivious to the fact that their words had been overheard, that their secret was spreading through the kitchen like poison through water. She thought of the women she knew who had given birth in the past 2 years and had not fallen pregnant again, despite being young and healthy. Mary, who was only 21. Elizabeth, who had cried for weeks, thinking herself barren. Rose, who had begun to believe God was punishing her for some unknown sin. It was not God. It was Dr. Marcus Whitmore, playing God with a scalpel and his scientific arrogance. That night, Sarah could not sleep. She lay on her thin mattress in the women's quarters, listening to the breathing of the others around her, and thought about freedom. Not the freedom that seemed impossibly far away, the freedom of the North or Canada that they whispered about when the overseers weren't listening, but a more immediate freedom, the freedom of her own body, the freedom to bear children if she chose, the freedom to not have her womb violated by a man who saw her as nothing more than livestock to be managed. The baby moved inside her, and Sarah made a decision. She would not give birth in Dr. Whitmore's clinic. She would run if she had to. She would hide in the woods like a wounded animal and deliver her child alone before she would let that monster touch her again. But running was not simple. Ashford Manor was surrounded by miles of rural North Carolina countryside, patrolled by slave catchers and their dogs. Any enslaved person found beyond the property without papers faced brutal punishment or death. And Sarah was 8 months pregnant. She could barely walk to the fields and back without pain. How could she run? The answer came from an unexpected source. Samuel, a man who worked in the stables and whom Sarah had known since childhood, approached her 3 days later as she carried water from the well. "I heard what you heard," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon for overseers. "About the doctor, about what he's doing." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. "You can't speak of it. They'll sell you away or worse." "I know what worse is," Samuel said, and his voice carried a weight of grief that made Sarah look at him more closely. "My sister Lily. She worked at the Thornton plantation before I was sold here. She died during a procedure that sounds mighty similar to what the doctor's doing here. The white doctor there called it progress too, called it science. She bled to death on his table." Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes. "What can we do? We're powerless." Samuel glanced around again, then leaned closer. "Not powerless, not completely. There are white folks who think slavery is wrong. Abolitionists, they call themselves. There's a Quaker family about 15 miles north of here, the Morgans. They help people reach freedom. If we could get word to them, maybe they could help expose what's happening here. Maybe they could stop it." "And how do we get word to them?" Sarah asked, hope and fear warring in her chest. "We can't leave the property." "I can," Samuel said. "I'm sometimes sent to town for supplies. Next time, I'll find a way to contact the Morgans. But Sarah, you have to stay safe until then. Don't let the doctor near you. If your time comes before I can get help, you find Aunt Ruth. She delivered babies long before Dr. Whitmore came here. You trust her, not him." Sarah nodded, gripping Samuel's hand briefly in thanks before they separated, moving in different directions to avoid suspicion. She had hope now, small and fragile as a candle flame in a storm, but hope nonetheless. The following weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah's belly grew larger, the baby's movements stronger, more insistent, as if the child inside her knew the danger that awaited. She avoided the clinic, avoided Dr. Whitmore's gaze when he observed the enslaved workers during their morning assemblies. But avoidance became increasingly difficult as her pregnancy advanced. She could feel his eyes on her sometimes, assessing, calculating, seeing not a human being, but a specimen for his experiments. He would walk past her in the fields, pause, make notes in the small leather journal he always carried. Once, he stopped her directly, placing a hand on her belly without asking permission, feeling the baby's position through her worn dress. "Any day now," he had said, his voice pleasant, conversational. "You'll report to the clinic when your labor begins." I want to ensure this delivery goes smoothly. Modern obstetrics has made such advances. You're fortunate to have access to proper medical care." Sarah had nodded mutely, unable to trust her voice, terrified that if she spoke she would scream. His hand on her belly felt like a brand, a mark of ownership more profound than the legal documents that declared her his property. He was claiming her unborn child, claiming the very processes of her body as territory he had the right to invade and control. Samuel managed to make 2 trips to town, but each time he returned, he shook his head slightly when their paths crossed. No contact with the Morgans yet, no help coming. The first trip had been interrupted by an overseer who questioned why Samuel was taking so long. The second time, he had found the Morgan farm, but no one had been home. Sarah felt despair creeping in like cold water, drowning her small flame of hope. Time was running out, her body was preparing for birth, the baby dropping lower, her hips aching constantly, false labor pains gripping her at odd hours. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late November, as frost sparkled on the ground and Sarah's breath misted in the air, her labor began. The pain came in waves, stealing her breath. And she knew there was no more time. The baby was coming whether help had arrived or not. She was in the fields when the first real contraction hit, doubling her over, making her drop the basket of tobacco leaves she'd been carrying. The other women working nearby looked at her with fear in their eyes. One of them, young Hannah, started to move toward the main house, presumably to inform the overseer to summon Dr. Whitmore. Sarah grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "No," she whispered fiercely. "Don't tell them. Not yet. Please, Hannah, give me time." Hannah hesitated, torn between obedience to the plantation's rules and loyalty to Sarah. Finally she nodded, helping Sarah to her feet. "Where will you go?" she whispered back. "Find Aunt Ruth. Tell her it's time. Tell her I'm going to the pine grove." Hannah squeezed her hand once, then moved away, trying to look casual as she headed toward the quarters where the older women prepared the afternoon meal. Sarah waited for the next contraction to pass, then began walking as quickly as her laboring body would allow toward the edge of the property. Every step was an act of defiance. Every moment she stayed away from the clinic a small victory. But she knew it couldn't last. Someone would notice her absence. They would search for her. And when they found her, there would be consequences. She found Aunt Ruth in the quarters, the older woman's face grave, but determined when Sarah whispered what was happening. Aunt Ruth asked no questions, simply gathered a few supplies. Some clean cloth, a knife for cutting the birth cord, a jar of honey for energy. "Come with me, child," Aunt Ruth said, leading Sarah not toward the clinic but toward a small storage shed at the edge of the property, hidden among pine trees. "We'll do this the old way, the way my mama taught me, and her mama before her. The way women have been bringing babies into the world since the beginning of time, long before men, with their instruments and their arrogance, decided they knew better." The shed was dusty, filled with old farm equipment, but it was private, hidden. Aunt Ruth spread some of the clean cloth on the floor, helped Sarah down. The labor intensified, waves of pain that seemed to crack Sarah open, body and soul. She bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming, not wanting to alert anyone to where they were. Aunt Ruth worked with steady hands, checking Sarah's progress, offering water, whispering prayers and encouragement. The old woman's voice was a lifeline, pulling Sarah through each wave of agony. "You're strong, child. Stronger than you know. Your mama birthed 7 babies, and her mama before her birthed 10. This strength is in your blood. This baby wants to be born free of his hands, free of his violation. You're giving your child that gift." Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, visible through cracks in the shed's walls. Sarah's world narrowed to pain, to breathing, to the primal work of bringing life into the world. She thought of her other children, of Rebecca and Thomas, wondered if she would survive this to see them again. She thought of the 18 women Dr. Whitmore had violated, wondered how many of them had endured this same pain, only to have their bodies betrayed during their most vulnerable moment. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the baby crowned. Sarah felt the ring of fire, the impossible stretching, and then Aunt Ruth's hands guiding, supporting, catching. The baby emerged with a sound like a small animal crying, a protest against the shock of cold air and separation. Aunt Ruth worked quickly, clearing the baby's mouth and nose, cutting the cord with hands that had performed this ritual countless times before. "She's beautiful," Aunt Ruth whispered, her old eyes shining with tears as she wrapped the infant in clean cloth. "She's perfect, and she's yours, Sarah, wholly yours. He never touched her. You did this without him. You protected her." Sarah wept as Aunt Ruth placed the baby in her arms, this tiny, perfect life that was wholly hers, untouched by Dr. Whitmore's instruments of violation. The baby girl's eyes were closed, her face scrunched and red, her little mouth working as she sought her mother's breast. Sarah guided her there, felt the tug of the baby nursing, and for a moment, despite the pain and exhaustion and fear, she felt something like triumph. She had done this. She had refused. She had found a way to protect her child from the violation that awaited in that clinic, with its gaslight and its instruments, and its doctor who saw them as laboratory specimens rather than human beings. "She's freedom made flesh," Aunt Ruth said softly, adjusting the cloth around the baby. "No matter what happens now, you did this without him. You protected her. That can't be taken away." But their triumph was short-lived. As Aunt Ruth cleaned up, preparing to sneak Sarah back to the quarters under cover of darkness, they heard voices approaching. Footsteps, urgent and angry. Dr. Whitmore's voice, sharp with rage, cutting through the evening air like a blade. "She should have reported to the clinic hours ago. Where is she? Find her, search every building, every field. She can't have gone far in labor." The voices were getting closer, dogs barking, their handlers shouting instructions. They had brought the tracking dogs, the same ones used to hunt runaways. Sarah's heart stopped. She clutched her newborn daughter closer, looking at Aunt Ruth with wild, desperate eyes. This was it. They had been found, and the price of her defiance was about to be exacted. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from the labor. "We tell the truth," Aunt Ruth said, her voice steady despite the fear Sarah could see in her eyes. "Let me handle this. You just hold that baby, and remember you're a human being, not property. Remember that no matter what the law says, no matter what he says, your body is your own." The door burst open, and Dr. Whitmore stood silhouetted against the dying light, two overseers behind him, their faces hard and pitiless. His face was a mask of cold fury, his usual pleasant demeanor stripped away to reveal the cruelty beneath. For a moment, no one spoke. Dr. Whitmore stared at Sarah sitting on the floor of the shed, the newborn baby in her arms, blood still on Aunt Ruth's hands from the delivery, and Sarah saw something flicker across his face. Not just anger, but something else. Humiliation. His control had been defied, his authority challenged, and he was not a man who tolerated such things. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice was quiet, controlled, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he had shouted. "Sarah, you were instructed to come to the clinic when your labor began. This is unacceptable defiance. Do you understand what you've done?" Aunt Ruth stepped forward, her voice steady despite her age, despite the danger. "The baby came too fast, Master Doctor. There wasn't time to reach the clinic. Mother and child are healthy. No harm done. The birth was natural and safe. Everything is as it should be." Dr. Whitmore's eyes narrowed, but he didn't look at Aunt Ruth. His gaze remained fixed on Sarah. "I will determine if there is harm or not. Sarah, you will come with me to the clinic now for proper post-delivery examination. The baby as well. There are procedures that must be followed, assessments that must be made." "No," Sarah said. The word came out small at first, barely a whisper, but then she said it again, louder. "No, I will not." It was perhaps the first time in her life she had directly refused a white man's order. The power of it, the terror of it, made her tremble. But she held her ground, held her baby close, and continued. "No, I will not. I know what you've been doing to us. I know about the 18 women. I know you've been taking away our ability to have children without our knowledge or consent during delivery. I heard you speaking to your guests, boasting about it, calling it science and progress. But it's not. It's violation. It's cruelty. It's treating us like we're not human beings." The overseers moved forward, hands reaching for their clubs, but Dr. Whitmore held up a hand, stopping them. He was staring at Sarah with an expression that mixed shock, rage, and something else. Something that might have been fear. Not fear of her, certainly, but fear of what she represented, the secret exposed, the comfortable lie of benevolent medicine stripped away to reveal the horror beneath. "Do you understand what defiance means here, Sarah?" Dr. Whitmore asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you understand the consequences? I could have you whipped. I could have that child taken from you and sold before she's weaned. I could sell your other children too. I could destroy everything you have left in this world." "I understand," Sarah said, her voice shaking but determined. "I understand that you have power over me, that the law calls me your property, that you can hurt me, punish me, take everything from me. But I also understand something else. I understand what you've been doing to us. I understand you've been taking away our most basic human right, the right to our own bodies, to bear children if we choose. I understand you see us as animals to be controlled and managed, as experiments to be performed on without consent. But I am not an animal, Dr. Whitmore. I am not an experiment. I am a human being, and this is my body and my child, and you will not touch either of us." The silence that followed was profound. Aunt Ruth had gone very still, barely breathing. The overseers looked uncertainly at Dr. Whitmore, unsure how to respond to this unprecedented act of defiance. A black woman, an enslaved woman speaking to a white man, a doctor, a property owner, with such direct accusation and refusal. It violated every rule of the social order they all lived under. It was the kind of thing that got people killed. Dr. Whitmore's face had gone pale, then flushed red with rage. "You know nothing of science or progress," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You are ignorant, ungrateful, and foolish. The procedures I perform are for the betterment of society, for the improvement of your race. I am trying to help you." "Help?" Sarah's voice rose, no longer caring about the consequences. "You're hurting us. You're violating us. You're taking away our most basic human right, the right to our own bodies, to bear children if we choose. You're not helping. You're playing God, and you're losing." "Losing?" Dr. Whitmore laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "I have performed my procedure on 18 women, 18 successful cases of population control. How am I losing?" "Because we know now," Sarah said. "We all know what you're doing, and we won't stay silent anymore. We'll tell everyone. We'll find ways to get the word out. You can sell me away. You can kill me. But the truth is already spreading. The other women know. The men know. And they're afraid of you, but they're angry too. And anger is stronger than fear." It was then that Samuel appeared at the door, breathless from running, and behind him were 3 white people Sarah had never seen before. 2 men and a woman, dressed in plain Quaker clothing, their faces serious and determined. "Dr. Whitmore," one of the men said, his voice carrying the authority of education and moral conviction. "My name is Isaac Morgan. These are my brother David and sister-in-law Patience. We've come from the quarterly meeting of the Religious Society of Friends to investigate reports of forced medical procedures being performed on enslaved persons at Ashford Manor. We have with us sworn testimonies from Samuel here, as well as written statements from several women who have been harmed by your actions. We're also accompanied by a journalist from the Philadelphia Abolitionist Quarterly who is documenting this visit. From behind the Quakers, another man emerged, notebook in hand, his eyes taking in everything with sharp intelligence. Dr. Whitmore's face went from red to white, the blood draining away as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. "This is private property," he stammered. "You have no right to be here. You're trespassing." "We have every moral right," Patience Morgan said, her voice calm but firm. "What you have been doing is not only a sin against God, but a violation of human decency. These women may be enslaved under the laws of North Carolina, but they are still human beings, created in God's image. What you have done to them is unspeakable." The journalist was writing rapidly, his pencil scratching across paper. "Dr. Whitmore, can you confirm that you have been performing surgical sterilizations on enslaved women without their knowledge or consent?" Dr. Whitmore looked around wildly like a trapped animal. The overseers had backed away, not wanting to be associated with what was unfolding. "This is scientific progress," he said desperately. "This is the future of population management. You abolitionists, you don't understand the complexities of maintaining order in the South." "We understand perfectly," Isaac Morgan said. "We understand that you have committed gross violations of human dignity in the name of a science that is nothing more than racism dressed in medical terminology. And we intend to make sure the entire country knows what has happened here at Ashford Manor." In the days and weeks that followed, the story of Dr. Marcus Whitmore and his experiments spread like wildfire. The Philadelphia Abolitionist Quarterly published a detailed exposé, complete with testimonies from the women of Ashford Manor. Other newspapers picked up the story, both northern abolitionist papers and even some moderate southern publications that found the doctor's actions too extreme, even for supporters of slavery. The scandal was enormous. Dr. Whitmore was forced to leave North Carolina, his medical license revoked, his reputation destroyed. The owner of Ashford Manor, a wealthy tobacco merchant who lived mostly in Charleston and had left the property management to Whitmore, was so horrified by the publicity that he sold the entire estate at a loss and freed several of the enslaved people, including Sarah and her 3 children, out of what he claimed was moral awakening, but what most understood as damage control. Sarah found herself free in a way she had never imagined possible. The Morgans helped her and several other women from Ashford Manor reach Pennsylvania, where they settled in a small Quaker community outside Philadelphia. She found work as a seamstress, raised her 3 children, and became an active voice in the abolitionist movement, speaking at meetings about what had been done to her and the other women at Ashford Manor. But freedom was not the same as healing. Sarah carried the scars of what Dr. Whitmore had done, both physical and psychological. She would wake in the night from nightmares of the clinic, the smell of carbolic acid, the sense of violation. Her daughter, the one born in the storage shed among the pine trees, grew up healthy and strong, but Sarah could never have another child. Whitmore had made sure of that during her previous deliveries. Yet in the midst of her pain, Sarah found purpose. She worked with other survivors of medical abuse, both enslaved and free black women who had been subjected to experimental procedures without consent. She connected with women who had been used by doctors to develop surgical techniques, women who had been studied like specimens in medical schools, women whose bodies had been violated in the name of science and progress. And she helped build something new. A network of black midwives and healers who served their communities with dignity and respect, who saw their patients as human beings rather than subjects for experimentation. She trained young women in the traditional birth practices that Aunt Ruth had taught her, making sure that knowledge was preserved and passed down. The story of Ashford Manor became a rallying cry in the abolitionist movement. It was used as evidence in debates about the humanity of enslaved people, about the moral bankruptcy of a system that allowed such horrors to occur. It appeared in speeches, pamphlets, and books. Harriet Beecher Stowe included a chapter inspired by Sarah's story in a later edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin. But beyond its political impact, the story of Ashford Manor became a testament to resistance, to the courage of enslaved women who refused to be silent about the violence done to their bodies, to the power of bearing witness even when the cost was high. Sarah never regretted speaking up that night in the storage shed, even though it had put her life at risk. Some truths were too important to hide. Years later, long after the Civil War had ended and slavery was abolished, Sarah stood in front of a crowd at a women's rights convention in Boston. She was 53 years old, her hair graying, her hands worn from years of sewing, but her voice was still strong. "They told us we were property," she said. "They told us we had no rights over our own bodies, that we existed only to serve their needs and their economy. And when we became inconvenient, when we became too many, they took even our fertility from us, without asking, without consent, without any recognition of our humanity. But we were human then, and we are human now, and our bodies belong to us alone." The crowd erupted in applause. But Sarah wasn't finished. The fight for bodily autonomy doesn't end with the abolition of slavery. Women of all races are still subject to laws and medical practices that treat them as less than fully human, less than capable of making decisions about their own bodies. We must continue to fight, to speak up, to demand our rights, not as a gift from those in power, but as our natural inheritance as human beings. In the audience that day was Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to receive a medical degree in the United States, and several other women physicians who had fought their own battles against a medical establishment that tried to exclude them. They listened to Sarah's words with tears in their eyes, recognizing in her story a universal struggle for dignity, for autonomy, for the simple right to say, "This is my body, and you cannot do this to me without my consent." Sarah's daughter, now a grown woman herself and a teacher at a school for freedmen's children, sat in the front row with her own daughter, Sarah's granddaughter, who was studying to become a physician. 3 generations of women, each carrying forward the lesson learned in that storage shed in North Carolina so many years ago. That freedom begins with ownership of one's own body, and that no scientific advancement, no economic argument, no claim of superior knowledge can justify taking that ownership away. The story of Dr. Marcus Whitmore became a cautionary tale in medical ethics courses, studied alongside other examples of the abuse of power in medical practice. But more importantly, it became part of the larger narrative of resistance to slavery, to racism, to the systems that dehumanize people for profit or ideology. It became a reminder that those who are oppressed are not silent, passive victims but active agents of their own liberation, fighting even when the odds seem impossible. Sarah lived to be 71 years old, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1892, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. At her funeral, people came from across Pennsylvania and beyond to pay their respects. Former abolitionists, women's rights activists, physicians, midwives, and dozens of ordinary people whose lives she had touched through her work and her story. Aunt Ruth had died years earlier, but Sarah had made sure that her contribution to the resistance at Ashford Manor was never forgotten. In every speech Sarah gave, she spoke of the older woman's courage, of how she had risked everything to help Sarah deliver her daughter safely. She was a healer in the truest sense, Sarah would say. She understood that healing is not just about the body, but about the spirit, about helping people reclaim their dignity and their agency. The clinic at Ashford Manor was torn down shortly after the scandal broke, the building dismantled, and the land left to grow wild. But the story of what happened there lived on, passed down through generations, a reminder of the horrors that occur when people are not seen as fully human, when their bodies are treated as resources to be managed rather than sovereign territory to be respected. In the years after the Civil War, as the nation struggled to reckon with its history of slavery, the story of Ashford Manor was sometimes minimized or dismissed by those who wanted to believe that slavery had been a benign institution, that enslaved people had been well treated and content. But Sarah and other survivors made sure the truth was told, documented, preserved. They gave interviews, wrote memoirs, spoke at gatherings, refusing to let their experiences be erased or softened for the comfort of those who didn't want to face the full horror of what had been done. And slowly, painfully, change began to happen. Medical ethics evolved to include principles of informed consent, of patient autonomy, of the fundamental right of every person to understand and approve any procedure performed on their body. The road was long, and violations still occurred, but the foundation was laid for a more ethical approach to medical practice, one that recognized patients as partners rather than subjects. Sarah's granddaughter, Dr. Anna Freeman, became a pioneering voice in medical ethics, drawing on her grandmother's experience to advocate for stronger protections for vulnerable populations. She worked to ensure that no one would be subjected to experimental procedures without full knowledge and consent, that the mistakes of places like Ashford Manor would not be repeated. But perhaps Sarah's greatest legacy was more personal, more intimate. It was the way she had taught her children and grandchildren that their bodies were their own, that no one had the right to violate them without permission, that they were fully human with all the dignity and rights that humanity entailed. It was a lesson born from terrible suffering, but it was also a lesson of hope, of the possibility of resistance even in the darkest circumstances. The fields of Ashford Manor eventually became farmland again, worked by free labourers who were paid for their work and could leave if they chose. The manor house stood empty for years before being purchased by a black family in the 1870s, a powerful symbol of how far things had come. The new owners knew the history of the place, the horrors that had occurred there, but they chose to reclaim it, to transform it from a site of oppression into a home of freedom. They planted a garden where the clinic had stood, filling the space with flowers and fruit trees, life growing from ground that had seen so much death and suffering. It was an act of defiance and hope, a declaration that beauty and freedom could grow even from the darkest soil. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, and then the 20th to the 21st, the story of Ashford Manor remained relevant. Each generation discovered new resonances, new connections to their own struggles for bodily autonomy and human dignity. Women fighting for reproductive rights found inspiration in Sarah's courage. People of color resisting medical racism and experimentation saw their own battles reflected in what had happened in 1844. Anyone who had felt powerless in the face of institutional authority found strength in the story of enslaved people who had refused to be silent. The lesson of Ashford Manor was ultimately about the indomitable nature of the human spirit, about the refusal to accept dehumanization no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against you. It was about the courage to speak truth, even when doing so put your life at risk. It was about the solidarity of people who supported each other in resistance, from Aunt Ruth and Samuel to the Quakers who risked their own safety to expose the truth. But it was also a warning. A reminder that the language of science and progress can be used to justify the most terrible crimes, that we must always be vigilant against those who claim the right to control other people's bodies for the supposed greater good. It was a call to question authority, to demand transparency, to insist on consent, to recognize that true progress can never be built on the violation of human dignity. Sarah's story, the story of Ashford Manor, became more than just a historical account of one doctor's crimes. It became a moral compass, pointing always toward respect for human autonomy, toward the recognition that every person, regardless of their race, class, or status, has an inherent right to control their own body and their own destiny. It became a testament to the power of bearing witness, of refusing to let injustice remain hidden in the shadows. And perhaps most importantly, it became a story of hope. Because even in the midst of one of humanity's darkest institutions, even when people were legally defined as property, even when the full weight of law and custom and economic power was arrayed against them, they found ways to resist. They protected each other. They preserved their humanity. They survived. And eventually they prevailed. The autumn wind still whispers through what remains of the old tobacco fields, now mostly suburban development and shopping centres. But if you know the history, if you listen carefully, you can hear in that wind the echoes of Sarah's voice, strong and defiant, saying, "No, this is my body. I am a human being. You cannot do this to me." It is a voice that still needs to be heard today, in every hospital and clinic, in every legislative chamber, in every place where decisions are made about people's bodies and lives. It is the voice of human dignity asserting itself against all attempts to diminish or control it. It is the voice of freedom, born from suffering but never extinguished, always calling us toward a more just and compassionate world. The story of Ashford Manor may have begun in 1844, but it has never truly ended. It continues in every fight for bodily autonomy, in every demand for informed consent, in every refusal to accept violations of human dignity. It continues in the descendants of Sarah and the other women of Ashford Manor, who carry forward their legacy of resistance and resilience. And it continues in all of us, whenever we stand up and say, as Sarah did in that storage shed so long ago, "No, I am human, and my body belongs to me."